Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to discuss transportation of gases, transport of gases in human beings, how gases are transported in human beings. Okay. So, our topic is transportation of gases. Transportation of gases. Which gases are transporting in our body? Generally, in our body, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Oxygen and carbon dioxide transports in our body. What is the meaning of oxygen and carbon dioxide transportation? Okay, here oxygen is entering into the body. So, in the process of inhalation, oxygen is entering into the body. In the process of inhalation or inspiration, what we call are also called inspiration. Inhalation, inspiration. So that is we can call especially for that is inhalation or oxygen is entering into the body based on the concentration. Carbon dioxide is sending outside the body. Sending outside the body. So that is we can call what we call that is exhalation or expiration. Exhalation or expiration. So exchange of gases occurs. Exchange of gases occurs. Exchange of gases. That process we can call exchange of gases. Okay, in mechanism of exchange of gases, what we learn? Inspiration and expiration. Inspiration and expiration. Inspiration and expiration. We can call exchange of gases. Expiration. We can call exchange of gases. Expiration. So that this is nothing but what mechanism of breathing. What we call mechanism of breathing. In two processes, breathing is completing within two ways. That is the inspiration and expiration. So exchange of gases occurs in the process of inspiration and expiration. So here, how these gases enter into the blood? How these gases are transported? How these gases means what? Oxygen and carbon dioxide. Oxygen and carbon dioxide. How these gases are transported? How these gases are transported in our body? That is our concept. Okay. So first of all, transport of oxygen. We have to discuss about what? Transport of oxygen. So oxygen is very important to us. So oxygen is why oxygen is very important. Why? Because oxygen only, oxidized food materials only gives us energy. So oxygen, transport of oxygen. What we are discussing? Transport of oxygen. How oxygen is transporting inside the body? So generally, okay, blood is useful to transport what material already we learned about the functions of blood. In blood is useful to transport the oxygen and carbon dioxide. So in blood is what? In two types of components is there. One is plasma, other one is what? Blood cells. 55% of plasma is there in blood and 45% of what? Blood cells. 45% of blood cells is there. So especially what gases are transport with plasma and blood cells. Gases are transport with plasma. So transportation of oxygen with plasma. First one. Transportation of oxygen with plasma. With plasma. So how with plasma? In plasma, approximately water percentage is 90 to 92% of water is there in plasma. 90 to 92% of water is there in plasma. So what happened? It is the what especially for oxygen easily dissolved. Oxygen easily dissolved in plasma. Why? Because in plasma water content is more. So that oxygen is easily dissolved in plasma. So through with plasma, okay, which is a dissolved form, dissolved form, oxygen is dissolved form, oxygen is transport with plasma, approximately 3% of oxygen is transport with plasma only. Only 3% of oxygen. It is dissolved form. So, okay, after that one, what second concept is what? Second concept is what? Most of the oxygen, especially how much of oxygen? Up to 97% of oxygen. So, second one is transportation of oxygen. Transportation of oxygen. Transportation of oxygen with hemoglobin, with RBC. With RBC means what? Hemoglobin. In RBC, hemoglobin is there. Hemoglobin is the pigment. So, generally hemoglobin, that means whatever pigment, whatever the cause of color, the hemoglobin, okay, hemoglobin is made up of generally 4 iron molecules or 4 ferrous molecules. Ferrous. So if you observe it there, one hemoglobin is made up of 4 ferrous molecules. 1 minute, just. Okay, 4 ferrous molecules. So if you observe it there, one hemoglobin, whatever the globulin protein, this protein attached with, combined with what? 4 ferrous molecules. Okay, so that is what it is made up of, what? Globulin protein with what? Iron molecules, elements, whatever iron elements are ferrous. Okay, so that is the structure of hemoglobin. So generally, exchange of gases occurs in alveoli. Generally, this is what? Alveoli. In alveoli, what happens? Exchange of gases occurs. Exchange of gases means what? Oxygen is entering into the alveoli. So, whatever oxygen entered in alveoli, it is entering into the blood vessels. It will enter into the blood capillaries. These are what? Blood capillaries. Blood capillaries. So, in blood capillaries, what happens here? Oxygen is diffuses. So, oxygen is diffuses into the blood capillaries. In blood capillaries, what is there in blood capillaries? Hemoglobin is there. So, hemoglobin tracking the oxygen, absorb the oxygen. Hemoglobin, whatever molecules of oxygen enter into the blood capillaries, whatever oxygen enter into the blood, in blood, RBC, red blood cells. In red blood cells, hemoglobin pigment is there. These oxygen molecules are combined with what? Hemoglobin, saturated with hemoglobin, associated with hemoglobin. Hemoglobin trapping. What it traps? Oxygen. So, already I am told here hemoglobin. So, whatever oxygen entered, based on the concentration of oxygen, if the oxygen concentration is increased in alveoli, it is diffuses into the blood. Which is in diffuses? Oxygen is diffuses into the blood. So, hemoglobin and oxygen. So, Hp plus O2 combined and form HpO2. What is the meaning of HpO2? Hp means what? Especially for hemoglobin, 4 molecules of hemoglobin, and so HpO2 4. We have to write like this. Okay. So balancing. So here hemoglobin combined with oxygen molecule, saturated with oxygen molecule. Affinity rate. Already yesterday I told the word affinity. Affinity is what? Based on the concentration. So affinity means what? Combining, attaching, or binding. Okay, bonding. So sorry, bonding of what? Hemoglobin. Bonding of hemoglobin. The affinity rate of hemoglobin with oxygen based on affinity rate with oxygen based on affinity rate of affinity rate with oxygen based on their concentration. So based on oxygen concentration. So oxygen concentration is oxygen concentration. If the oxygen pressure is more in alveoli, affinity rate is also more. What is the meaning of affinity rate? Binding rate. Sorry, bonding, especially for it is attached, it is a combined, okay, bond with the oxygen, attached with oxygen. So based on what rate of what concentration. So hemoglobin is combined with oxygen and combined it from oxyhemoglobin. It is what? Oxyhemoglobin, HbO2. What is that one? Oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin. So if you observe it there, four molecules of oxygen combined with one molecule of hemoglobin. So in hemoglobin, I am already told hemoglobin is made up of four molecules of what? Four molecules of ferrous. Each ferrous ion combined with what? One molecule of oxygen. One. So if you observe it there, one hemoglobin binding with four molecules of oxygen. Four molecules of oxygen. So it is 100% saturated. 100% saturated. So hemoglobin is 100% saturated based on the concentration of oxygen in alveoli. So one ferrous ion combined with one molecule of oxygen. So hemoglobin made up of four ferrous ions. These one molecule of ferrous attached with one molecule of oxygen, one molecule of oxygen, one molecule of oxygen, one molecule. 1, 2, 3, 4. So one hemoglobin combined with four molecules of oxygen. Very important. So that means hemoglobin, okay, with RBC, oxygen transportation of oxygen with RBC, up to 97% of oxygen is transport with RBC. Up to 90% of oxygen transports. Up to 90% of oxygen is transport with what? RBC only. Hemoglobin with hemoglobin only, like what? Oxyhemoglobin. So what happened? It is transporting with oxyhemoglobin. When the oxyhemoglobin enter into the nearby oxyhemoglobin, the formula is what? HbO2. That is the four molecules of HbO2. That is we can call oxyhemoglobin. This oxyhemoglobin, when they reach the tissues, in tissues what happened? Oxygen concentration is less. Already we learned about exchange of gases. Oxygen concentration is less in tissues, so oxygen is diffuses. It's divided what? Hemoglobin and oxygen is entered into the tissues. So try to understand. That concept is going on. So anyway, through with hemoglobin, through with RBC, 97% of oxygen is transported through with RBC. So now what we are going to discuss? Now we are going to discuss about oxygen and oxygen dissociation curve. Oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Now we have to discuss oxygen and hemoglobin. So oxygen and hemoglobin dissociation curve. How to observe? That is what. How can we can determine what, especially oxygen and hemoglobin saturation rate? How much of oxygen is required to saturate 100% of hemoglobin? When the hemoglobin saturated with oxygen. So if you observe it, then we will observe the graph. When we are observing the graph, This is the y-axis. This is x-axis. In y-axis, you have to take hemoglobin saturation rate. Hemoglobin saturation rate. So we have to take 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. These are what? Hemoglobin saturation rate. What is the meaning of saturation? How much hemoglobin that used to binding of what? Oxygen molecules. So 10, 90, 100. So 100% of saturation. So if you in x-axis you have to take partial concentration of oxygen. Oxygen concentration in x-axis, hemoglobin saturation rate in y-axis. So you have to take here 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. So we have to observe what we took in y-axis. We took what? Hemoglobin saturation rate. In other one, in x-axis we are taking PO2. PO2 means what? Partial pressure of what? Oxygen pressure. So I'm already told hemoglobin molecule. Hemoglobin generally it absorbs what? Oxygen. It is made up of 4 ferrous molecules. 4 ferrous ions. These 4 ferrous ions, each ferrous ion combined with what? Oxygen. So that it is a combined with what? 4 ferrous ions. One hemoglobin molecule is combined with what? 4 oxygen molecules. It is made up of 4 ferrous ions, 4 iron ions. Iron is combined with elements are combined with what? Iron element is combined with the oxygen. So first of all, when in alveoli oxygen is entered, when in alveoli oxygen concentration is increased, when in oxygen concentration is increased, so slowly hemoglobin absorb the oxygen. So I have started the curve not in straight, slowly. First it is observing. When in alveoli oxygen is entered, this hemoglobin first it absorbs some oxygen. First one ferrous ion is what? Binding with one ferrous ion binding with oxygen. So I am started slowly. So slowly, just slight curve. Okay. So then what happened? Oxygen saturation rate is increasing. Oxygen saturation rate is increasing. First it started slowly. What is the trapping of hemoglobin? Trapping the hemoglobin oxygen percentage, saturation rate of slowly it started. It is increasing the saturation rate of hemoglobin and oxygen. Now what happened? Okay, 4 molecules of hemoglobin, 4 ferrous ions are binding with what? Binding with oxygen molecule. So 100% saturated. After saturation rate is what? Curve is 100% saturated. So it is a constant. That is a constant means what? Totally saturated. Which is saturated? Oxygen, hemoglobin come back binding with what? Oxygen. Totally what? 100% saturated. Affinity rate is 100%. In which time affinity rate is 100%? Affinity hemoglobin and oxygen affinity rate is 100%. 100% at the time when it is when in oxygen concentration is more. When in oxygen concentration is more. When in oxygen concentration is more, hemoglobin saturated. How we drawn what? Sigmoid curve. This is the S-shaped curve. This is what we call S-shaped curve or sigmoid curve. Sigmoid curve. How it comes this sigmoid curve? First of all, this is hemoglobin Hb, this side oxygen. So first saturation rate, hemoglobin and oxygen slowly increasing, then saturated hemoglobin with oxygen, then finally 100% saturated is showing like a what? Sigmoid curve. When it shows what sigmoid curve, the sigmoid curve is showing when oxygen concentration is more. At the time what happened, 100% of hemoglobin saturated with oxygen. So now what happened? Sometimes what happened, so this curve, okay, this curve comes, okay, so this is the 90, so the approximately 97-98% as what, especially so is saturated. So now what happens sometimes? Sometimes what happens when carbon dioxide PCO2 concentration is increasing, so oxygen levels are less and carbon dioxide levels are more. Carbon dioxide is increasing in blood, so carbon dioxide and temperature and hydrogen ion pH value. So when these factors are increasing, which factors are increasing? Carbon dioxide, temperature and hydrogen ions, concentration of pH value. When these concentration is increased, when these concentration increase, automatically what happens? Automatically oxygen and hemoglobin affinity rate is decreased. Oxygen and hemoglobin saturation rate is what? Decrease. Why the saturation rate is decreasing? Why saturation rate is decreased? Hemoglobin not only binding with oxygen, hemoglobin and also binding with carbon dioxide also. So hemoglobin not only binding with oxygen always, based on concentration. For example, oxygen concentration is more in blood, hemoglobin is binding with oxygen. If carbon dioxide concentration is more in blood, hemoglobin is binding with carbon dioxide. So the affinity rate is based on the concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Saturation rate of hemoglobin based on concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide. If the oxygen is more, it is binding with oxygen. If the carbon dioxide is more, it is binding with carbon dioxide. So more affinity is showing what? Based on their concentrations of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So what happened in blood? When in sometimes what will happen when the carbon dioxide percentage, temperature is increasing and hydrogen ions are increasing in blood, automatically what will happen? The saturation rate, that means the hemoglobin and oxygen saturation rate is turns to right side. It is moving to right side. So if you observe it there, one more sigmoid curve, it is moving toward in right side. The saturation rate is decreasing. So if you observe it there, saturation rate only 70%. If you draw like this, saturation rate is only 70%. Okay, here oxygen concentration is only 80, so saturation rate is also decreasing. Try to understand why the saturation rate is decreasing. So, okay, curve is moving toward the right side, downward. Why? Because it is 100% saturated. First situation, when the concentration, both concentrations are equal, the saturation rate is 100%. But when the oxygen levels are decreased, automatically saturation rate is also decreased. Here number is decreased now. See. So this is what we call oxygen hemoglobin saturation rate. Oxygen hemoglobin saturation rate based on concentration levels of carbon dioxide and temperature, and also what we call pH value. Sometimes this pH, carbon dioxide, and also what temperature is also affect. These factors also affects what oxygen levels. It affects what hemoglobin and oxygen saturation rate. So this curve is called oxygen hemoglobin dissociation. It is not associated. It is not totally binding. What happened? It is totally not binding. Why it is not binding? So oxygen and hemoglobin is how is dissociated? Is not associated. How it is associated? The reason is what these factors are. Which factor? Carbon dioxide, temperature, and also pH value. When these factors are so affecting hemoglobin and oxygen saturation rate. Okay, that is what oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay, now we are going to discuss about carbon transportation of carbon dioxide. Okay, so oxygen is transported only 3% with blood, 3% with plasma, and which is dissolved in form. In a plasma, water content is more, so that it easily dissolved in oxygen is easily dissolved in water, so that 3% of oxygen is transported in water, especially plasma. And the remaining 97% of oxygen is transported in what? RBC. In RBC, hemoglobin is there. In oxygen binding with the word hemoglobin and combined and form what oxyhemoglobin. So with oxy, it is transported to the tissues through like oxyhemoglobin. And in tissues, it is diffuses. Oxygen diffuses into the tissues. Okay, this is the process of transportation of oxygen.